time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Seattle City Councilmember Nick Licata. Nick Licata is served on the Seattle City Council since 1998. He's one of the most progressive voices on the council who has, amongst his many other accomplishments, fought for paid sick leave, a $15 minimum wage, and in 2007 working to pass Initiative I-91, which prohibited the city from supporting sports teams unless such investments had a fair return. He is the founder and former board member of the Civic Foundation, former president of 911 Media Arts Center Board, founding board member of the Capitol Hill Housing Improvement Program, a nonprofit that made housing loans available and low-income housing units available, and founder of the Seattle Sun, a community newspaper which serves Seattle's inner-city neighborhoods and was published from 1974 to 1982. Nick, thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for having me on your show, Mike.
I really had to cut down big time on your bio and all your accomplishments.
Lots of junk there.
It's a lot of really cool stuff, including, I got to say it, Give Peace a Dance, which was an event I remember.
That was a lot of fun. From
way back. So housing affordability is a big issue that's in the news currently, and just this last Monday, the Housing Affordability and Livability Advisory Group came out with a report.
That's right.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, the mayor, to his credit, recognized that housing affordability was critical to the city. He pulled together a very large group, 28 people. It had a lot of developers, but it also had some advocates for low-income housing, particularly, I believe, some nonprofit developers. And they did come out with a report. They were about almost 2 months behind schedule when they were planning on something. When it came out, it was marketed as a sort of grand compromise where the developers would get essentially increased opportunities to build higher and more dense development, and in exchange they'd have to provide some affordable housing. However, the document that is being released and eventually will be transformed into legislation to bring to the council, a lot of things need to be filled out. For instance, they come out with something like 60-plus suggestions or recommendations. Many of them you have to go to state legislature to get approval. Some of them are not really all well thought out in the sense that they have a lot of space there. The biggest concern I have is that when you look at, for instance, the linkage fees, they are only, which is basically a way of providing affordable housing by linking, when there's new development, the developers actually have to pay a fee. Other cities have it in this area, and that is not tied to an upzone, whereas inclusionary zoning, where someone builds something, is tied to an upzone. So I want to break those two items apart. The linkage fees, which is something that Michael O'Brien on the city council has pushed for a long time, as well as myself and others, basically said, okay, we'll just do the linkage fees for commercial development, not residential. And I appreciate the effort that O'Brien's put into it, but I'm still going to be pushing for linkage fees for residential. I think that's a critical element that it will raise over a period of 20 years, I think up to $1 billion. It's critical that we tap into that revenue stream. And with regarding the inclusionary zoning, which means that developers would have to put aside, according to the Hollow report, 5 to 7% of the units to be affordable. While it's admirable, the timeline they present, I think, is rather sluggish. There's not a resolution that will be presented to the city council until fall of 2017. So basically we're looking at 2 years from now. They do have to do an environmental impact statement, things of that sort, but all that work has already been done on linkage fees, so there's no reason to wait on linkage fees. We can proceed with residential linkage fees as soon as we want. So that's going to be my strategy there on the inclusionary zoning. One of the downsides is that there's discussion about upzoning large parts of the city. There's still a debate going on whether it's only like 10% of single-family areas that will be upzoned or whether all of them will be impacted. That gets pretty far into the weeds, and that will be debated out over the coming months, perhaps even throughout the next year.
And you had just recently proposed taking the concept of rent control, rent regulation to the state of Washington?
Yes. In fact, I was told by the Speaker of the House, Frank Chop, and he just confirmed it because I was talking to him over the phone yesterday, that one of the problems that the Democrats have in the state legislature is that they've never really been formally asked by the city government to pursue rent regulation in the sense of lifting the ban. Before 1980, Seattle did have that opportunity. There actually was a vote on it. It was defeated. So, that means that avenue is left open. But when in 1980, the governorship and both houses were controlled by the Republicans, they slammed through a ban on, or basically preempting municipalities from doing any sort of rent regulation. In fact, I've had the only legislation passed in the last 18 years when I got on the city council to even do the slightest modification, which basically says that if you have a 10% or more increase in your rent, the landlord has to provide you, 60 days notice. Otherwise, it's 30, and actually, even that would have been subject to attack in the courts because it could be considered rent control. That's how broad the language is written. So it does need to be lifted. And so I went to my colleagues on the city council and I said, hey, this is a reasonable request. We're not saying we're going to have rent control tomorrow. We're not even saying we necessarily will have it. Some of us oppose it. Some of us are in favor of it. But it's ridiculous. We can't even have a fruitful conversation unless we have that authority. So council members Gene Godden, Bruce Harrell, myself, O'Brien, and Councilmember Sawant all agreed that we would support something like that. And we would support that legislation. It would basically be a resolution to the state legislature. So I wrote it up, and it was referred to Councilmember Okamoto's committee, which I was hoping that he would be able to basically move the legislation before we enter the budget cycle in November. He's informed me that he may or may not get to it until the September sometime, which means that it wouldn't even come up before the council until December because everything stops. And if it goes in December, it's most likely to be kicked over to next year, which I won't be on the council any longer, and who knows what will happen, and it'll be buried. It's a way of basically, in my opinion, killing legislation. It happens all the time. You just delay and stall, and eventually people forget about it. So I'm introducing new legislation. The same bill, different title, which allows me basically to have it referred to my committee. And I've told Councilmember Okamoto that and we had a very good discussion. I said, since you're not going to really deal with it in a timely fashion and you're not overworked, but his committee has a lot of materials in front of it, I'm going to do him a favor and move it to my committee. And I would just introduce a new piece of legislation. So that vote's going to be on the 27th. We'll see if I get the 5 votes. I'm hoping that council members Gene Godden and Bruce Harrell, who support the resolution, would be willing to support referring this basically a new version of the same bill over to my committee so we can move on it before we begin before November. So that's going to be a critical vote. And will be talking to other council members. Hopefully they will also agree to at least have a discussion in my committee about this and hopefully support sending this resolution as a notice to the state legislature that we would like to have this ban lifted.
So how much of a role does citizen input play in, let's say, this upcoming 27th vote? I
think it'll be a very critical role. All politicians do not like to be beaten over the head. They don't like to be seen as being pressured, so I would not encourage those kind of tactics, but I think they do like to be informed about where their constituents are. And certainly if they're aware that their constituents would encourage them to vote yes to refer this legislation to my committee, that would be important. And I think they would hopefully respond accordingly.
Do you have a sense for what the reasoning was back in 1980 when the state basically shut off the city's approval?
I mean, the reasoning was pretty much free marketers, libertarians, Tea Party people, even before it predates them, but the philosophy is the same. It's written Milton Friedman. It's basically, you let the market economy solve all of our problems. There's no need to regulate it. Of course, the only time they like to have regulation is when there's tax incentives or when there's tax cuts because they need it to keep in business. But if it comes down to having a business that responds to the public needs, then they don't like that kind of regulation.
So, getting back to the concept of rent control, you are one of the participants in an upcoming debate this coming Monday.
It's actually a debate. We used to like to call things discussions, but I think debate's a useful term here. It's going to be a controlled debate. It's not going to be a screaming match. It's going to actually be, hopefully, a discussion over the issue of whether rent should be regulated. And the shorthand is rent control. The more nuanced language is rental regulation or rent stabilization, but it all comes down to, is it proper for the market to totally determine the access to housing? Or does the state play a role? In the state, I mean government, our democracy, play a role in influencing that decision. We already do. We already have regulations, for instance, on the quality of housing. We can't have housing that is unhealthy, that's unsafe. We have building codes. We have health codes. We already regulate it. And then the argument is, well, yeah, but we don't want the city government or anyone to control it. Well, fact is that rents right now, it's not like they're uncontrolled. They're controlled by the people who own the property. I mean, there's control. And so the question is it solely in the hands of people who own property to control, for instance, the access to that property? We control it through zoning. We decide where you put apartment buildings, where you have multiple units. There's that kind of control. The rent control has generally been defined mostly by opposition as, just to put a cap on rents and it'll never be increased, and therefore no one will ever build new rental units. Well, first of all, that model is not what we have in the 200 cities that have rent control right now in the United States. And I should say it's much more prevalent in other countries. In fact, Berlin just redid their rent control, and it's working. They've been able to lower overall rental prices by over 3% within a period of months. But let's look at what we want to do here in Seattle. Is we'd want to adopt a model that, like many other cities, you do allow for rent increases. You don't want rent gouging. You don't want someone to discover that they've got a 50% increase, a 100% increase, and they've got 30 days to move out. We do want to have the type of rent control that encourages new development. And studies by economists who are not coming out of a political angle have shown that those cities that often have some regulatory control over the rents actually have a more stable rental environment, and consequently, developers want to produce multi-family structures, apartments, whatever, because the market's more predictable. It stops the heavy swings, the highs and the lows. Most of those highs and lows are due to mini housing bubbles, where you have a lot of speculative money coming in because they think that before the bubble bursts, they're going to make some money. Or it also involves taking existing housing, which I should say, the non-subsidized market housing provides the largest percentage of what's considered affordable housing. The new housing that's being built is, for the most part, unaffordable. It costs too much, and because not just construction costs, but obviously the financing. But much of the rental property in Seattle right now, is affordable. Not the majority of it, but there's a percentage that is. But what we're seeing is, like, for instance, Lock Haven and other apartment buildings, the prior owner sells it, the new owner comes in, they put a granite kitchen tabletop in, and they jack the rent up 100%. And it's what I call almost like faux remodeling. And they, will the new owner will argue that, well, we have to cover our bridge loans and things of that sort. But their business pro formas are all based on, quite honestly, not realistic rental rates that they're going to be charging. And so a whole community is disrupted. Many people have to move outside the city, and that's what we're seeing. The term gentrification basically means you take poor people and you take people who are often biased against getting job opportunities. Those would be minorities, African Americans, whatever, new immigrants. And you're basically saying you can no longer get to your place of work by either, public transit or simply driving there or bicycling, walking, whatever. You now have to move outside the city, which means a heavier burden on public transit, which means that obviously more expensive for them to drive longer distances and also more congestion on the roads. And then we end up with more taxes to build wider roads. I mean, it pushes the burden onto the public.
And how much did you kind of alluded to it? So much of this seems to be based on a culture of knocking down old, perfectly usable structures and putting in new structures.
That's what's been happening. And we know there are numbers on demolitions. There's not as good numbers on like conversions, but we know that during this kind of market where the vacancy rate is low, you have a tendency then to start converting apartments into condos, and more importantly, you take a lot of rental units. Often they're maybe duplexes or triplexes in low-rise zones. They're torn down, so you end up losing anywhere from, well, you could have a single-family home with multiple households in there, and so there you could displace as many as 20 people and replace it with basically rents that are 2 or 3 times higher. With folks that, maybe new to the city, that's okay, but they're not going to be the same people who live in that community perhaps for years.
So another myth is in regards to rent regulation and or control is that most economists disagree with.
Well, it's funny. There's when you look at some of the research that's been done, you realize it's based on projections which are based on hypothetical models, not on hard data. There was a guy back in late 80s and did some, in quote, research, and it turns out he was actually was a conservative journalist, and the information that he was basing it on was what other economists had done. There was a survey of economists. When they looked at what those economists did, they didn't do any original research. They didn't crunch any numbers. They were doing projections of numbers based on assumptions on models, but they didn't actually crunch any collect any original data. When that was done, that's when they discovered, and these studies show the changes that are going on, that in fact the housing markets in those cities that had rental control were more stable, and that new construction was not discouraged. And ironically, the biggest restriction on new construction is zoning, when you think about it, and the biggest impact on vacancy rates, lowering vacancy rates, is job production. The more jobs you provide, the more people move to an area, the more demand there is for apartments, and then that is going to outpace the ability to build apartments. So that's exactly what's happening in Seattle. People who are developers who argue, well, it's just a supply side problem, we'll just build more apartments out of it. It doesn't work because it's not a static economy. We're creating, thankfully, more jobs. We're creating more jobs than there is housing available. More jobs than actually they can get online right now. So the vacancy rate is shrinking and the rents are going higher. And those developers are not going to continue building new units as soon as the rents drop, because they're in for, obviously, a profit. And their loans are based on a certain level of rents. So as soon as there's some sort of equilibrium being approached, the supply will shrink. It will shrink to basically allow for the higher rents that they're charging to be sustained.
So in addition to rent regulation, What would you propose as solutions to the affordability problem here with housing in Seattle?
Well, again, there's the residential linkage fees. There will be inclusionary zoning, hopefully at some point, requiring new units to be included in all new construction. Many other cities are similar in our size, have inclusionary zoning. We don't. There was, for a long time, an interpretation that our state constitution did not allow it, and now we understand that it can be allowed. So those are two other tools that we can look at. There is the housing levy, which I think is good. The housing levy, the mayor has proposed, and I suspect the council will support increasing the housing levy. But you have to understand, of the 30-some thousand subsidized units, permanently low rent units in Seattle now, those are all subsidized from taxpayer dollars. So what we've done is we've created a situation where the burden of providing affordable housing is falling on taxpayers, which is hurting people on fixed incomes, seniors. It's hurting folks who's not seen their salaries or wages increase over a long period of time. So that means your working class folks and middle class people. And that is a trend that's been going on for quite a while. So you cannot just rely on taxes to provide affordable housing. You have to rely on those folks who are basically making profits, in many cases very comfortable profits, to have a smaller profit margin. Not no profits. Okay, we're not talking about having a state-run economy. We're talking about a regulated economy in the area of allowing a public need to be met, and also to still allow people to engage in private business and make a decent living.
And what do you think about the concept of the city getting involved with the purchase and or being a landlord over housing?
Well, in a way, we sort of do that now, but we do it through third parties. Seattle has actually perhaps one of the most vibrant, what's called basically private nonprofit housing developers in the country. We have at least a dozen that are out there purchasing buildings and or building new ones to either preserve low-income housing or provide new low-income housing. And we do use public funds to do that. So, but we don't own them directly. That is sort of an older model. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad model. I would like to see the city put in much more money directly. Whether we actually would own and operate that housing, I don't think that's as critical as actually having the money to build it. So I think we should look at bonding, for instance. I've looked at public banking. I'm looking at participatory budgeting. I'm looking at ways to get more money into the public hands to use for basically basic public services that would benefit all of us and keep the economy growing and keep people within the city. But there are various sorts of ways of approaching that, and that's what we're exploring right now. I think we have to keep our minds open to all these possibilities.
So just about 5 minutes left. So I'm heartbroken that you're not going to be running again for council. I realize you do have another life to live. What would, from your years working at Seattle City Council, what's the recommendations you'd give to people who are, concerned and or passionate about these issues to be able to wield as much power as one can and going up against, let's say, developers that seem to be able to get inside and have regular chats with many of our council members?
Well, there's two trends. One is new people who get elected to city council, and those who are already there, certainly. They have to hear the concerns of normal people. Developers are very dependent on local laws because of zoning, because of permits, because of exclusions sometimes or variances. So they're in the office all the time. And they're very nice people. It's not like if you're a developer, you're a bad person, okay? Nice personality. In fact, many of them are progressive in the sense that they may support progressive social causes. But they also have an agenda. They want certain things from the council that translates into them doing more profitable business. That may not be in alignment with neighborhood groups, may not be in alignment with working people, and those people are not heard because they don't have paid lobbyists. They're working. They're not walking the halls of City Hall. So they need to be organized into groups that run campaigns, that also take the time to have some volunteers, to invite council members over to their home, into their community, and also go into City Hall. But also build alliances. Work on trying to get one or two council members to commit on paper to sponsor a piece of legislation to basically make a change, to introduce a resolution, to make a change in the municipal code. And then people who are running for office, you have to learn that you have to have a vision, what you want. And you don't have to be afraid of, quite honestly, not getting reelected. One of the things I've often thought about, this is crazy, but when I first got elected, I thought, okay, I'm here for 4 years and that's it. And therefore, I'm assuming I'm not going to get reelected or I won't run. And that really relieves you from a certain sense of looking over your shoulder. You then decide, okay, I'm just going to have, quite honestly, you're going to have fun doing something that you think that's good. And I think that's an attitude that I encourage anybody in office to have.
All right. So speaking with Seattle City Council member Nick Licata, and you are going to be one of the participants in the debate this coming Monday, Town Hall Seattle, rent control in Seattle. And you will be joined by Council Member Swant and Rep. Matt Manweller. Is that correct?
That's correct, from Eastern Washington. Mm-hmm.
And Roger Valdez.
That's correct. Uh-huh.
So that should be very
That's
lively.
very good. The doors open at 5 at Town Hall. The debate begins at 6. It looks like it'll go for a little over an hour. It's very structured. There's going to be 4 questions that we pose to each of the two sides. We both agreed to the questions, and no surprises there. And we each are going to have timing, so people aren't going to be mouthing off forever. And we both sides have a chance to do rebuttal to the comments made by the other side. And in fact, we solicited their information, their suggestions for questions, and adopted a number of them. So everything's perfectly fair. I want to emphasize that, and but it will be very educational.
Town Hall is normally in the summertime and can get pretty warm. I'm just imagining what it'll be like up on stage for that. And then finally, you are in the process of writing a book that should.
Well,
be
the book has already been written. It's basically becoming a citizen activist. Stories, strategies, advice on how to change the world. And Sasquatch Books is publishing it in January, and I hope to be able to use it as a way to help citizens have a better understanding of how to look at the world around them and what the opportunities are for changing it.
All right. So you'll still be involved with us.
Oh,
even
yes.
though you won't be at
very much so.
City Council. So, all right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this
Thank you
morning.
for having me on your show. Appreciate it.